Today, I want to talk about why it is that trans women with autogynophilia are so unlikely to admit that autogynophilia played a causal factor in their gender dysphoria. The preferred explanation is that I had a repressed gender identity that I was born with. And that repressed gender identity is that of a woman, of a female, whereas the theory of autogynophilia says, no, it's actually not a identity issue, it's a sexual issue. It's a matter of a paraphilia, an orientation, a kink, inverted heterosexuality, however you want to describe it. The root cause is sexual in nature. And this is evidenced by the fact that the vast majority of trans women admit, in various internet forums and surveys and all the research that's been done, they admit that in their past, prior to realizing that they're trans, that there's some sexual element related to, gender issues, whether that's looking at, transgender pornography, reading transgender erotica literature, gender swapping, interested in gender bending, arousal at cross-dressing, arousal at the fantasy of being a woman, arousal at the thought of embodying, the female anatomy, whatever. So, these sexual fantasies, they have a history of all that, but they just deny that is actually what caused the gender dysphoria. They say that that sexual exploration was a downstream side effect of the root identity issue. So the identity issue caused the kink stuff because the kink stuff was the only outlet for that identity to be expressed. What I want to get at is how come trans women are so unlikely to admit? And I think it has to do with understanding that autogynophilia is a root cause, but that does not mean there's no other causes at play. Because this is one of the big straw man of the theory of autogynophilia, which is that it's just a fetish. Blanchard said it's just the root cause. And once that root cause starts you down this pathway of exploring gender through the sexual domain, often that process gets escalated, and then you start, getting more and more interested and being more and more feminine to embody the fantasy more and more and more. And at that point, you start encountering other trans women, and then you start saying, what if I was like them? What if I went down that pathway? And then once you start engaging with these trans communities and the memes and the culture, and you start relating to the fact that you seem very similar to these other trans women, like they seem like you, they have similar life histories, similar stories and narratives, and so you start relating to them, and so now you start asking yourself, should I transition? And once you start asking yourself that question, should I transition, the mind is going to come up with other rationalizations, other justifications, other reasons. And then later on, if that person does transition and you ask them hey, why did you transition? First thing that's going to pop into their mind is all those justifications and reasons that they came up with. They're not going to trace it back to the root cause, which is the sexual element which drove them down that pathway to become interested in all this stuff in the first place. So that is why so many trans women are just not self-aware about this, because that root cause is operating more at the emotional unconscious level, whereas all the reasons and rationalizations and post-hoc justifications for why they transitioned, those are much more salient in the conscious mind. And furthermore, there's a social acceptability bias such that all those post-hoc autobiographical narratives, it's way more socially acceptable to give those reasons versus saying that this is because some paraphilic, or some weird sex thing or whatever that drove me down this pathway. That is just not an acceptable narrative to tell your friends, your family, your coworkers, put it in your bio online or whatever. No one wants to admit it. You will be perceived negatively. When we're talking about causation, Blanchard's theory of autogynophilia is only talking about a root cause, but for any given phenomenon, particularly in the human domain with complex human behavior, there's going to be multiple causes for any given behavior. Autogynophilia does not say that it's just a fetish, because all these other reasons and causal motivations factor into the ultimate decision to transition, because when you're sitting there deciding, do I transition, do I not transition, your mind is not just how can I live out my sexual kink or whatever. Now, I think in some cases with for example, sissy kink, if that gets taken too far, that sexual motivation can be pretty explicitly there in the conscious mind as like a factor that you're considering. But in most cases, particularly as you begin to explore this stuff more often and you sort of get habituated to the sexual novelty and sort of the dopamine rush and the euphoria goes away, and you start just thinking about like, whether your life would be better or worse. You think about, all these other factors. It just doesn't seem sexual to your mind anymore because the thing evolved and you're latching onto the post-hoc rationalizations. And that is why there's so little self-awareness in the trans community in regards to autogynophilia, despite trans women admitting that they have a history of kink or sexual exploration or sexual fantasy or eroticism. All that gets downplayed to give a more socially acceptable narrative. And also subjectively, it just doesn't feel like that is the main cause, because the post-hoc rationalizations are much more salient. They're spun up in the format, the medium of language and story, whereas sexual motivation is unconscious, not able to be articulated. And so when you ask a trans woman a question, why did you transition? And when you're dealing with the level of story about your own life, you're going to latch on to rationalization in the format of language. So this is my theory in regards to why there's so little awareness, a self-awareness of autogynophilia being a root cause. And it's only when there's going to be more discussion, more discourse, and also it has to become socially acceptable in the narrative. Otherwise, it just will never be a thing. And this is where I see other people starting using terms like autosexual versus autogynophilia, because it seems to have less stigma. We always want to present ourselves to the public world in a way that is most flattering to us. That is a fundamental cognitive bias. Until that those narratives around autosexuality become socially favorable, they're not going to win out against the gender ideological post-hoc rationalizations that spin up these nice stories about how you're born in the wrong body, you're born with this innate mismatched gender identity. That stuff is way more palatable, way more socially acceptable versus like admitting that the root cause of all this is like, sexual in nature.